Okay, welcome to Humanities 2. This is an introduction and analysis of Western culture from the Renaissance up to the 20th century, a time period covering roughly from the 1350s up to around 1960, around 600 years. I'm C. Ivan Spencer, your professor for this course. I have been a professor of the history of ideas for 22 years. I was educated at the University of Texas in Arlington with a PhD in the Humanities. Much of the content of this lecture is very enjoyable for me to deliver. It's something that I have studied for many, many years. The humanities are very dear to me, having a doctorate in the humanities, and so I have a personal connection to this very content. It's something that I've been teaching for a long time and enjoy doing. What we're going to be looking at in this course are many different movements that are part of the beginning of modernity. We're going to first look at the Renaissance, and here we're going to look at some important movements that feed into and are going to support the beginning of modernity. And we're going to look at the resuscitation of classical culture and the future hope that it will bring. We'll be looking at Pico de Mirandola's oration on the dignity of man. We'll also be looking at Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. Then we'll move on to the Reformation, our second lecture. And here we will look at a return to the Bible alone for Christian truth. We will look at Desiderius Erasmus's Discourse on Free Will, reading some selections there, and then also Martin Luther's work on bondage of the will. This was one of the greatest debates of the 16th century, where Luther and Erasmus are debating one of the most important issues concerning human development and human nature, and that is the free will. We'll also read a little bit of John Calvin and his Institutes on Christian Religion. After that, we'll move to the third lecture on modernity and modern science. And here we're going to look at a new method that is beginning. The modern world, the modernists were trying to begin again and start over, much like the humanists of the Renaissance were. But now they're going to go off in a completely different direction. And we're going to look at the engendering of the scientific revolution. Some of the readings that we'll see here will be Francis Bacon's Novum Organum, which sets forth a new inductive method, a way to study the world and gain new knowledge about the world afresh. This will be kind of an important part of the scientific method that will soon emerge. We'll look at René Descartes in his Discourse on Method and how he places the individual and the search for certainty at the center of this modernist project. Next, in the fourth lecture, we'll look at British empiricism, John Locke and David Hume, and we'll read Locke's essay concerning human understanding and David Hume's inquiry concerning human understanding. There's a big shift that's going on at this point in the history of ideas, and it is a shift towards epistemology. It's an attempt to try to lay out a new method for learning, a new method for knowledge. And the empiricists, the British empiricists, are going to give us a kind of insight into learning that is going to help engender science and modernity. Next, we'll move on to the Enlightenment, and there we will read Kant's Synthesis of Epistemology, and we'll look at his work, What is Enlightenment, and we will discuss the whole Enlightenment culture. Next, we'll move on to politics, and we'll look at the social contract theory and rule by consent. Here we go back to John Locke, one of the British empiricists, but his second treatise on government pretty much lays out the ideas that have been adopted by many people in the West on what is a proper rule, what is the proper center of power, and that would be rule by consent of the people. And so here, social contract theory will be prominent. We'll also look at Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his work, The Social Contract, and also a little reading from his Origins of Inequality. We'll also take a look at some of the founding fathers of the American Republic, Madison, Jay, and Hamilton, and the Federalist Papers, and some of their seminal thoughts on how they conceived the idea of the U.S. Constitution. Next, we're really getting up into the 19th century now, We've moved on past the Enlightenment up into the 19th century, and we're going to see some of the most seminal thinkers for setting up the 20th century. But here in the 19th century, we're going to see four primary atheist thinkers. First, we'll look at Marx and the rise of communism. We're going to read some of his economic and philosophical manuscripts, and we will also read a little bit of his contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. Marx was a Hegelian, and so we're going to have to understand that connection to Hegelian thought. And so to understand his understanding of communism and government. Then we move to Darwin, and he's kind of the final key of the naturalistic view of humanity. We'll look at The Voyage of the Beagle, Origin of the Species, and one of his letters. Now, Darwin is going to, like I said, be the final key to a full-blown naturalistic understanding of humanity. So he's going to be that final piece that puts in place the ability to see humanity in a fully naturalistic way. Then we'll move on to Nietzsche. I call him the Übermensch of the existential turn away from nihilism. Nietzsche is a very provocative thinker. We'll read some of his genealogy of morals and some of the gay science. Nietzsche struggled with nihilism. He's a very interesting study. He moves from Christianity as a young man to full-blown atheistic naturalism. But he follows his atheistic naturalism all the way as far as he possibly can, and it leads him to a nihilistic position. This view that ultimately one cannot know and there is no truth. And ultimately, since one cannot know and there is no truth, there is nothing. But this is a very difficult place to live, this nihilistic worldview. And so he tries to escape it. And one escapes this through sheer tenacity of will. And we will see this existential turn, this attempt to create meaning out of nothingness. Then in lecture 10, we move on to Freud, Coping with the Naturalistic Human Condition. We'll read Civilization and Its Discontents. Here, Freud is going to explain that human beings, to survive and to get along and prosper, we have to live in civilizations. But to live in a civilization, we have to suppress and repress all kinds of urges that we have. And this essentially then takes us to the point of being neurotic and unhappy. And so this is why we're highly civilized, but we're very discontent. And so we will look at Freud's, we'll try to take a look at his entire view of humanity in psychology. It's certainly a thoroughgoing atheistic view of the human being. Then in lecture 11, we get up to John Dewey in the 20th century, a thoroughgoing American pragmatist, a consequentialist, who will say that education needs to be to prepare people for a technical age and for a technical society. So education will take a very pragmatic turn here. And so what we need, according to Dewey, is not classical education that human beings had been exploring for the past 2,000 or 3,000 years, but what we need is a technical and pragmatic education. We're going to make some connections from Dewey to the very projects in education today that are focusing on classical education. Next and last, we lead to the 12th lecture, C.S. Lewis. I call him a mere Christian in the aftermath of modernity. We'll read his Abolition of Man. And so the Abolition of Man will basically explain to us how and we got to where we are. It's a great capstone work for looking back at the modern turn and where the modern turn has taken us. All right, so throughout these 12 lectures, there are some key themes that I want you to watch for and to trace throughout this course. Of course, one is the rise of modernity, modern science and technology. Modern thinkers intentionally and consciously took away or look away from the classical and the medieval and the Renaissance mentality. They're embarking on a new course of knowledge and new methods A new epistemological project undergirds this entire cultural shift. And soon after this project began, modern science, already conceived, was born. And modern science developed into a full-grown and complete way to understand the world. Mastering nature, rapid application of scientific understanding to practical needs fueled technological innovation that continues all the way to this point. So there are great material rewards that accrued to humanity through the rise of science and technology, but it's also powered ways to control and to decimate humanity. We're going to see this with World War I and World War II, which are going to be great challenges to the modern project. So eventually, we're going to see that the project of modern science to improve humans' needs led to challenges that threaten the very project of modernity itself. Another key theme is the decline of religious influence. The cultural context of rising secularism increasingly pressures religious belief today. At first, deism emerges as a kind of religion of reason. Deism requires that beliefs about God must pass through a kind of filter or a grid, a test of reason. You can't believe anything about God unless it's reasonable. Thus, miracles are not reasonable, and so miracles were not believed, including revelation. And so the deists only believed things about God that were rational to believe. A robust naturalism then arises in the 19th century that we saw with Marx and Freud and Nietzsche and such, with a flurry of thinkers. These four horsemen of the early atheism will basically explore in different ways psychology, culture with Nietzsche, science with Darwin, and politics with Marx. Every aspect of atheism will be explored by these four guys and applied. Then we will see a rise of pluralism that engenders religious freedom. But pluralism is a double-edged sword, because pluralism, while it will give individuals the ability to worship God or be religious as they choose, it will also essentially relegate religion to a realm of merely personal choice and relegate it away from the public life. And so some of the consequences of the decline of religion in public life will be obvious to us. Next, we will see another theme is the rise of the nation state and the social contract theory in the Renaissance age. Nation states will become into existence for the first time. The nation state is an evolving concept, but basically it is the idea that a defined political unit, the nation, will have complete sovereignty over everything that goes on inside that nation. Centralized power will be a way to organize society. The first nation states, England, France, Spain, and then finally America, was the first great nation state that existed as a republic. Then we will see the birth and ascendancy of individualism, our final and fourth theme. Renaissance humanism and nominalism will alter our culture by placing the individual in a highly prominent role. We are so individualistic today that we don't know it. We're like a fish in water. We don't know that we're in the water. And so individualism is something that has totally transformed our culture from the days of the Renaissance. Before the Renaissance, individualism did not really exist. It was not an emphasis. But the shift on the individual towards emphasizing the individual will become something that will totally transform our culture. So what exactly is individualism? Well, there are different conceptions of it and different degrees of individualism. But individualism is putting the individual at the center of life, the center of knowing, and also at the center of significance and the center of meaning. And so instead of finding the center of that, for example, in a transcendent being like God, we have now put the individual at the center of all these things. And so we're going to explore individualism as we see it throughout all these 12 lectures and these many different thinkers. So I hope you enjoy this lecture series on humanities and the modern world.